Yes, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start, I would like to join Chris Fields and to thank the Norwegian government for the ongoing support of the IPCC process, especially for supporting the authors from Norway that have contributed to the various chapters, for instance, to the energy chapter, which is presented today by myself. I'm a coordinating lead author of the energy system chapter. I'm a substitute for Ottmar Edenhofer, who is unfortunately ill today. But on behalf of him and his co-chairs, I would like to thank you all for your ongoing support for organizing this event and for taking the climate problem in a serious way. It is always tempting for us in the IPCC to give recommendations to say what we should do. If you open the newspapers after the release of an IPCC report, normally you would read sentences like the IPCC is recommending something or another thing. But actually, this is not what we are allowed to do. What we are allowed to do is simply to summarize the existing knowledge in the literature about, in our case, the mitigation options addressing climate change, how we can mitigate climate change, how we can reduce the emissions. So we have to summarize this in a policy relevant way, but we are not allowed to be policy prescriptive. In this sense, we are exploring the solution space. We are something like map makers, where policymakers later on can select their goals. They can find some information how to go there, what are the adverse side effects of going to the different goals, and what might be potential co-benefits. The report in our working group, the third volume of this fifth assessment report, is structured in the following way. We have some framing chapters, a general introduction into the problem space. We have discussions about economic efficiency of mitigation measures, about equity aspects, about fairness, about sustainable development, all discussed in the framing chapters. We have an important chapter about historic emissions, where we see that there is really a big problem. And then in addition, there is one further very prominent chapter about transformation pathways, so the ways we can achieve low mitigation stabilization goals like the 2 degrees Celsius goal and similar objectives. In the sector chapters, we are discussing what we can do from a sector perspective: energy systems, building, transport, industry or human settlements, and agriculture and forestry is discussed there. And in the policy chapter we get additional information on how policy can support the transformation and what are the side effects, what are the implications, how good policies are interacting or whether they are counteracting. All these things are discussed there. We have, as usual, a summary for policymaker, technical summary, 16 chapters, 235 authors have contributed. We have 900 reviewers that supported us with their comments. There are more than 2,000 pages, 10,000 references has been taken into account, and more than 38,000 comments from the supporting reviewers were to be addressed, and we hope that we did so in a careful way. If you consider the historic emission, you see that compared to the last decades, the very last decades from 2000 to 2010 is a decade where the emission actually has increased much faster than in the decades before. This is astonishing because in this decade we had already in place some mitigation policies, and therefore we have to find a way to explain how this happened, although we all have thought that we have realized the threat and that we would like to do something against ongoing climate change. You see that the biggest part of this emissions coming from carbon dioxide producing fossil fuel and industrial processes, a further one from agricultural and forestry, and there are a couple of additional gases which have to be taken into account as well, like methane and various other greenhouse gases, which are indicated here. If we are going to the country groupings where these increases in the emissions have occurred, then we see that in the low-income countries we have quite stable emissions. They are broadly coming from the agricultural and forestry field. We have a strong increase in the lower mid-income part here, which would contain, for instance, India. We have a very strong increase, mainly related to increased emission from the energy and transport sector and the industry, which is the country grouping where, for instance, China is belonging to a very dramatic increases observed there. And in the high-income country group, we see that we were able to broadly stabilize the emissions, at least in that group. If we go to the description of per capita emissions, then we see that the per capita emissions are actually increasing as well, especially in the upper middle income group here, though in China, in Asia, especially there, the per capita emissions are increasing as well. But we have to emphasize that there is a big range of per capita emissions in the various country groupings, though there are there are differences between the groups, but within each group there are dramatic ranges as well that must be taken into account if we have to assess these things, for instance, from a fairness point of view, whether we can ask already countries which have now grown in terms of emissions, but as well in terms of economic welfare, whether they are able to join us now in making real mitigation efforts. If we have a consideration of what is new in this report, and then it is especially an investigation of something which is called net import and net export emissions. So there is a recognition that some of the countries have high emissions already, maybe this one here, the high income countries, but they might have even higher emissions if the emissions are taken into account which are originating in other countries in the event where products are produced there which are later used in the high income countries. And you see if this product emissions taking place somewhere else are taken into account, the emissions would be increased here. And for upper middle income, for instance, especially in China as the biggest country there, would be smaller if we have this fair consideration of the emissions and their respective origins. If we go to the different contributions to emission growth, then we see that if we make a decadal consideration and we take into account the decomposition of the reasons, we see that we had, for instance, in the time between 1990 and 2000, that we have an increase of the emissions due to population growth, due to economic growth expressed in GDP per capita. We had a decrease of, or decreasing influence on the emission growth due to improvements of energy intensity, energy efficiency improvements, for instance, are to be counted here, and carbon intensity of energy, so the amount of carbon dioxide which is produced by releasing 1 unit of energy had been decreasing here as well. So we saw a trend where we replaced fossil fuels first in the early decades by nuclear energy, for instance, then by gas and coal to gas, fuel shifting, which results in lower carbon dioxide emissions, and later we had a contribution from renewable energies as well. But in the last decade we have a change of the situation here. We have way back to higher carbon dioxide emissions per energy unit, and this is simply expressing the huge demand or usage of coal in Asia for running the energy systems there. If we ask ourselves what would happen if we go ahead simply in the business as usual case, if there is no mitigation at all, then we would expect a world where we have changes in the temperature of broadly 4 degrees Celsius or even up to 5 degrees Celsius. So we would be back in the world which Chris Field has presented as a 4C world. And if we really would like to go below 2 degrees Celsius with a likely chance, then we have to select these carbon dioxide concentration ranges here for 430 to 480 parts per million, quite often expressed as 450 parts per million, simply as broadly the center of that range. So 450 parts per million broadly would be fitting with a likely chance to 2 degrees Celsius. And you see that in this case, the scenarios which we have investigated, and we made a big database containing 900 mitigation scenarios investigating the different concentration levels here, shows us that we have to go down dramatically with the carbon dioxide emissions on a global scale. And some of the scenarios already indicate that we might learn to go into negative carbon dioxide emissions in order to take out carbon dioxide later on, which we have already emitted before by technologies like biomass and carbon capture and sequestration. If we have a look on the required upscaling of low carbon energy supply technologies, then we see that we have really a dramatic upscaling once again in this 450 parts per million objective. We would have from 2030 or from 2010 to the level requested in 2050, this would be 300% upscaling of low carbon energy supply technologies, summarizing renewable energies, taking into account potentially nuclear energy as well, carbon capture and sequestration, either with fossil fuels or with biomass, is considered at that place here. If we look at delayed mitigation, what are the implications of the delayed implication, then we see that the cost-effective mitigation scenarios, which would give a world where we stay likely below 2 degrees Celsius, are the ones which are expressed here in this dark green field. And you see that these cost-effective mitigation scenarios are lower, a little bit lower, or much lower in 2030 compared to our current state. If we go ahead, as we are doing now, if we even take into account the Cancun pledges, the promises of the different nations to do something against climate change, we see we are actually on a track which is not consistent with cost-effective climate protection. It will cost us more than that is needed if we go through that window here. So there is a strong recommendation at that point, if we would like to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, and if we would like to do so in a cost-effective way, we should start early and we should be lower compared to the current state in the year 2030. If we are not as fast, if we are here in the light green parts, then we have to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions. What you see here is the annual rate of change in carbon dioxide emissions later on, beyond that point, from 2030 to 2050. So if we are lazy now in the coming decades, we have to go down much faster further on. And you see that we have an emission reduction here of -6% per year, which is a dramatic one. I might give you an indication from a German perspective, as we had the reunification of the eastern part of Germany and the western part. We had an entire eastern part where we replaced lignite-fired power plants by gas-fired power plants, and we had, during that phase, an emission reduction for entire Germany of 2% per year. And if we speak about 6% per year on a global scale, this is really a dramatic, ambitious, and therefore it is really questionable. I cannot say for sure, but at least it is questionable whether mankind is able to achieve such high emission reduction rates. In addition, obviously, if we are lazy a little bit here, then the upscaling which we will face later on, it's much more dramatic compared to a situation where we start now and where we go down in a smooth way towards low emissions. In mitigation costs, the assessment of these mitigation costs vary widely. If we would like to come up with 450 parts per million, then the estimated consumption losses are in the order of 1.7% in the year 2030. We have broadly 4% by 2050 and higher values later on. This sounds dramatic if you say, well, this might imply in the worst case in the year 2100 that you are losing 10% of your GDP, but you have to take into account that during the same century our economic system on a global scale would grow by 900%, and if we lose from this 900% growth 10%, it would be a little bit lower, but it would not mean a dramatic threat for economic development, neither for our economic welfare here in the developed countries, nor for the opportunities of developing countries to go ahead and to develop to a state which they are satisfied with. We therefore thought it is important to express this in a different way, simply to avoid the misinterpretation here, and you see that we have come up with this number, which is 0.06 percentage points less growth compared to a situation where we normally have a growth between 1.6% and 3% per year. So only the growth rate is a little bit lower, but growth in itself, economic growth in itself on a global scale will not be threatened by mitigation, even if we would like to go to very ambitious climate protection goals. In addition, I have to emphasize that all these cost estimates are pure mitigation costs. We have not been able to find enough literature so that we made a complete assessment of the benefits of climate protection. This will be an effort which is addressed by the synthesis report, or maybe even later IPCC reports, because it is not easy to really figure out what are the benefits of climate protection, the avoided damages, and we have excluded, because the literature was not able to give a comprehensive picture here, co-benefits as well related, for instance, to local air quality. If we go to technologies and ask ourselves what technologies do we need, I showed you before that we need an upscaling if we would like to come up with 450 parts per million, 2 degrees Celsius, of 300% of low carbon technologies. I emphasize this group is taking into account renewable energies, nuclear, carbon capture and sequestration in the fossil fuel field, and concerning bioenergy. I had the impression that after the release of the report, at least in Germany and maybe in other countries as well, there was a recognition that the IPCC is recommending something like nuclear energy or CCS. You must be very careful. We are simply looking at 900 scenarios. Most of them are cost-effective scenarios. Some of them are showing nuclear, some of them are showing carbon capture and sequestration technologies, but it is not the case that we need all three options if we have the broad scaled groupings, renewable, nuclear and CCS, but at least we need one of these options. We need a low carbon option. Efficiency improvements in themselves will not be sufficient. We do not need necessarily all three, renewable, nuclear and CCS, but it is cheaper to use the entire solution space. And if we constrain ourselves to two of these options, then we have to simply figure out what are the cost implications. If we exclude, for instance, by purpose, nuclear energy on a global scale in the future, then the cost increase would not be as dramatic as compared to a situation where we don't have carbon capture and sequestration on board, or where we have limited bioenergy. The reason for this is that if we would like to go to low carbon emissions, we can do so by renewables quite well if they are becoming cheap due to our support in the future. We can select nuclear, we can select CCS, so we have some selection opportunity. But if we are forced, because we are lazy in the coming decades, to go to negative emissions, there is only one meaningful approach broadly, namely bioenergy and carbon capture and sequestration. And therefore you see this pronounced cost increase here in this package of carbon capture and sequestration and bioenergy. If you would not like to go into that direction, and there might be reasons because the risks are not really investigated in detail concerning both carbon capture and bioenergy usage, then you would need at least a dramatic afforestation program where you increase the number of trees taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. You need one option simply to take carbon dioxide back to something either in the ground using CCS or in the plants by afforestation. There are co-benefits for human health and other social goals which are expressed here. You see the particular matter concentration at different places on Earth, and you can imagine that if we are replacing coal-fired power plants by cleaner technologies, we have significant co-benefits. The air is becoming cleaner, and this is a big chance for especially developing countries. The thing that I have emphasized already is once again stressed here. If you see now on a sectoral perspective the different fields, transport, building, industry, electricity, and agriculture and forestry, then you see that with the exception of this agriculture and forestry part here, all other sectors would expect increasing emissions over the coming decades. If we would like to stay below 450 parts per million, 2 degrees Celsius, as I emphasized, we see that all sectors have to take on their share, they have to contribute to that goal. In the demand sectors, building, transport, industry, we would have an increase of energy efficiency and low carbon supply at the place where you are using the energy at home, in the buildings, in the industrial facilities. We would need low carbon technologies. And we have, especially if CCS is allowed, a dramatic decrease in the energy system, and we go even beyond the zero line. So we have here this negative emissions with bioenergy and carbon capture and sequestration. If we don't allow that, if we have to stay here in the positive part, you see that we need a substantial contribution from agriculture and forestry to compensate for the missing option of bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. If we go to the investment patterns, then you see once again simply looking at the 900 scenarios, not saying we have this for sure. Investments in nuclear, much higher investments in renewables. We have investments in power plants with carbon capture and sequestration. We have less investments in fossil fuel power plants without CCS. That's clear. We're having a demand for energy, and we are replacing the technologies by low carbon ones, and therefore other ones will not be needed to the extent we know them now. We have lower investments in the extraction of fossil fuels, and we have big investments in energy efficiency across all sectors. Unfortunately, it's not possible currently because the models are not always give us this information to make a balanced view, because if you have investments in renewable energies, you are avoiding the usage of fossil fuel, and you have to compensate, or you have to take into account the cost of the avoided fuels in order to have a fair assessment. This is not provided by all of the scenarios we have investigated, though we cannot make this comparison, but at least it is a first indication. I take this type of diagram not normally as a description of the costs we are facing. Normally, I try to sell these diagrams here for those of you who are interested to go into the respective markets to sell technologies in these fields. You see the amount of money which is in front of you, and you might take to your own side here. Okay, since the assessment report 4, we have seen some policies which were put into practice. We have quite often policies that try to integrate multiple objectives. They emphasize co-benefits, and they would like to reduce adverse side effects. Interestingly, sector-specific policies have been more widely used than economy-wide market-based policies. Here we would count, for instance, efficiency standards in the demand sectors or support for renewable energies in the energy sector, while here we would take into account something like emission trading or carbon taxes. Regulatory approaches and information measures are widely used and are often environmentally effective. Since the assessment report 4, cap and trade systems for greenhouse gas emissions have been established in a number of countries and regions, and there is already a linkage of these systems which starts to become interesting. In some countries, text-based policies specifically aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions alongside technology and other policies have helped to weaken the link between greenhouse gas emissions and GDP or GDP growth. It is expressed in this complicated way because if you observe simply lower emissions than you had before, and you have a couple of policy enacted, a carbon tax and support for renewables or something like this, you cannot disentangle this quite easily later on, and you can say it was only the carbon tax or only the support for renewables which was responsible for the lower greenhouse gas emissions. The reduction of subsidies for greenhouse gas related activities in various sectors can achieve emission reductions depending on social and economic context. This is clear as well, I guess. And then there had been a consideration that actually greenhouse gas emissions, once they are emitted, are in the globe, they are overall everywhere, and therefore we have to work together in order to solve the problem without any global assessment and without global policies, at least without taking on board the biggest emitters. The problem will not be easy to be solved. In order to take on board many countries, we have to consider equity, justice and fairness aspects, and we have to inform about the diverse risks which are associated with the different mitigations, options and scenarios as well. That concludes my talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. We already have 3 questions and remarks in the audience. We will have time for hopefully all of you. We will get out the microphones then. And you should ask for these. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I would like to return to your point about, sorry, I'm from the University of Oslo, Beate Sjåfjell. I'm the head of the research project Sustainable Companies. I would like to return to your point about mitigation costs not threatening economic growth. I would like to turn that around and ask, does not continued growth threaten the planetary boundaries, including climate change and biodiversity? And does continued economic growth, even decarbonized to some extent, fit with Chris Field's inspiring point about using the opportunity that the threat of climate change gives us to achieve robust economies and vibrant societies, to achieve sustainability? Should not a part of a larger picture be to investigate how we can achieve sustainable, vibrant, robust, steady-state economies? Thank you.
And you have to make your answer very brief. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes. So the brief answer would be, most of the models don't take into account that we are reducing economic welfare by purpose. There might be a reduction simply if it's quite expensive to get the energy, and therefore you have often a function which says if it is expensive to get the energy, we are using a lower amount of that, so the traditional elasticity is taken into account, and sometimes the economic growth is even forced to be lower, to stay below a goal. But quite often, most of the solution is actually coming from efficiency improvements and low carbon technologies. One thing is for me very important. I'm not sure whether this is really now in the report, but my own framing based on the last assessment report is the following. If you go to the socioeconomic scenarios and you see the growing developing countries which are actually developing, getting richer like China is doing now, and if these countries are getting richer, they start to have lower birth rates, and the lower birth rates gives hope that the population might peak and decline afterwards on a global scale. And therefore economic growth, for me at least, is a hope that we might be rich enough to use novel technologies, that we might be rich enough to have low birth rates. And if we have a peaking population, for me at least, it is the only chance to solve this problem. And therefore I'm a little bit reluctant to be in favor of degrowth ideas. They might be helpful. I would be obviously in favor of quality growth, but degrowth in itself, simply to have less economic growth, is dangerous in a world where you need money for novel technologies and where economic development is needed to solve the problem.
And I will not open for a debate on that. We will have you and two more, and then we have to stop. Come on. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. I'm Ida Helmark, working at NORAD. I have a question with regards to export and import and supply and demand. The graphs and tables that you show on greenhouse gas emissions patterned for regions and countries, can you please elaborate a little bit more if that includes the import and the demand for consumption products, for example? Because usually we talk about, I'm from Sweden, so there we're very proud of that we have managed to reduce our emission reductions. But that's only, if you look in our country, but if you include the import and the demand and the consumptions, it's a totally different picture. So could you please elaborate a little bit more on that, explain the graph, and also maybe comment on if there's a risk of misleading the politicians and also us, the population, and what we need to actually do to reduce the emissions further. Thank you.
And I ask you again, not ask him too wide questions because we only have 5 minutes we can use on this. So yeah.
Yes. So the main idea is actually what it is expressed here. These are the actual emissions happening in the country in itself, in the high-income countries. And if we take into account the products which we are importing and the emissions occurring at the place where they are produced in foreign countries, then we would get higher emissions, and they are shown here as the upper boundary. In addition, I'm completely with you. If we are in rich countries, if we are taking our industry to developing countries, we see in the rich countries lower emissions. We can do so a couple of times, but at the end of the day, all the developing countries are becoming rich countries that don't like to produce steel, if you like, and we cannot go to the moon to do it there. So on a global scale, structural change will not solve the problem. Yes.
Yes, come on.
I will try to do it brief, even though it's a big question. My name is Kalle Hestedt. I work with wind power. You probably realize you're in a country which is a large fossil fuel exporter. The fossil fuel industry usually say that they only provide a product which is being demanded, which is being asked for. And I wonder whether you could say a few words on which role you see for fossil fuel companies and countries to structure their extraction and production policy, which will result in changed emissions. Demand and supply question. Yes. Thank you.
So we have investigated the options to come up with lower carbon dioxide emissions, and therefore I would like to emphasize that this does not imply automatically that we don't use fossil fuels. This is often the case, but if we go to carbon capture and sequestration technologies, we can use coal and we can use gas to do so, and we can use gas to decrease emissions if we shift from coal to gas, at least in the intermediate time frame for 1, maybe 2 decades. This might be a good option, provided that emissions of natural gas usage, so the fugitive emissions, the methane emissions in the supply chain, for instance, are low. And this must be emphasized because it has given to some confusion as well. This statement of the IPCC that natural gas is part of the solution space is emphasized in the summary for policymaker, provided that the fugitive emissions associated with the supply chain are low or mitigated. And this is important. If this is the case, it is an option which should be taken into account.
Mm-hmm. And the last questions from the audience.
Yeah. My name is Nils Roll Hansen, and I'm a professor of history and philosophy of science. But my question is rather political. I want to know, to what extent is China inside the IPCC? Are they participating in this process? And to what extent are they then interested in analyzing the consequences of a 2-degree aim?
Mm. China is part of the IPCC, and actually China is part of the problem. You see here that we have a big increase of the emissions of upper middle income, and China would count here, or Asia. We have taken Asia as a big basket for these countries in our energy system chapter. But I have to emphasize that this should not be considered to say China is a guilty one and we don't have hope to solve the problem, because first of all, as Chris Fields has shown, China is in a range where it might be impacted by climate change. So it might have a self-interest in doing something against climate change, first of all. Second, China is requesting a huge amount of energy. This comes from coal, yes, as you see here, but it comes from other sources as well, and it comes especially from renewable energies in the last decades. China has developed to a country which is now becoming the world supplier of cheap renewable energies, and therefore for me there is really hope that China might be the key player that one day might stand up in climate negotiations and is saying, I am one of the most responsible ones, but I am able and I'm capable because I'm now rich enough to solve the problem together with you. And therefore I would not see it as a good sign if this is really put in a frame that China is only the guilty one. China is becoming rich and might really provide a solution to this global problem.
Thank you very much.